gums at each other any chance they get. The fight clock is brought to you by Modelo. One of the greatest knockouts you'll ever see. It's time
for you to sit back, relax, and listen to a complete and fucking utter armchair expert give his completely and utterly useless opinions on the one hell of an amazing sport that is MMA.
G'day, guys. Now, it has indeed been a solid 2025 for the UFC, and I just thought that, as is tradition, we would do a very quick recap for the year. So why don't we just very quickly start it off? I might get Google up so I can make sure I can get a bit more detail about these events. But I have them all written down here in my phone. So we shall do our recap. It'll probably be a very quick one. I'll just rattle off through them. So let's look up UFC 311 so I get a full picture. UFC 311 in January to start off the year. It was to be, let me see. It was meant to be Islam versus Arman Tazarian, the rematch, but Arman had to pull out, so it ended up being Islam versus Renato Moicano for the lightweight division championship. I believe this was Islam's last defense of the lightweight championship, which I will bring up later because we know what happened. We know where he went and what happened. But Islam did defend the lightweight championship with a round one submission. Also, Merab, I believe, had his first bantamweight, which again changes later in the year, which we'll talk about. First lightweight title defense against Umar Nurmagomedov, and there was a light heavyweight fight between Yuri Prohaska and Jamal Hill, which Yuri Prohaska won in round 3 with a TKO. But now we get to February. We have UFC 312 in Sydney, Strickland versus DDP 2, and DDP retained quite easily. We'll just look it up so we've got, again, the full picture. And also Weili Zhang beat Tatiana Suarez. I can't remember if this was for the belt or not, actually. No, it was for the belt. Sorry. So Weili won her belt back here. And Taliesin Teixeira beat Justin Tafa. Jimmy Crute. That was a draw. I forgot about that. And Jake Matthews got a win as well. I do remember thinking that this fight or this card was quite underwhelming. And to be honest, for an Aussie card, compared to some of the other cards we've had here, I think it was quite underwhelming. But anyway, so that was UFC 312. We now get into March with UFC 313. Pereira versus Ankalaev for the light heavyweight division title, and shockingly, Ankalaev, I think his name's pronounced, got the win over Alex Pereira, which was a little shocking because Alex Pereira had indeed been on quite a run before this, and he was unseated for the championship at this event. Also, Justin Gaethje beat Rafael Fiziev in their rematch, I believe it was. That's really all it's worth mentioning, to be honest, about UFC 313. But we then get into, I believe, April with UFC 314. And Volkanovski versus Lopez 1. Obviously, Alexander Volkanovski won the featherweight division championship for the second time. Had his dad in the cage, giving him a hug. It was a very wholesome moment. Honestly, that might be the photo for this podcast, Volk winning the belt back for a second time. But yeah, that was UFC 314 in April. Also, one other fight worth mentioning. Paddy Pimblett beat Michael Chandler quite convincingly in the third round with a TKO. That was really the moment I think everyone realized that Michael Chandler was no longer going to be a contender. So, yeah, that was UFC 314. But we get to May and UFC 315. We have two Aussie fighters getting the title in a row. We have JDM beating Bilal Muhammad by decision. And I remember vividly where I was and how I reacted to this. I actually have it on video. Unfortunately, as we know now, this was to be short-lived, but we'll get to that. Valentina also defended her flyweight title against Manon Fiorot. Jose Aldo lost to Alaman Zahabi, and I think he retired from memory after this fight. I think he retired, I'm pretty sure. I probably talked about this in the podcast after it, so if you want to know for certain, go back and check that out. But yeah, that was UFC 315. We then get into June and UFC 316. Merab versus Sugar Sean 2, and Merab beat Sugar Sean by submission in the third round to retain his belt, bantamweight belt yet again. We also had Kayla Harrison winning the women's bantamweight title, and this was the infamous moment where Amanda Nunes came and confronted her in the cage and set up the fight that is going to be happening later this month, which I will probably talk about at the end of this podcast. And also Calvin Gastelum was on the card, fought Joe Pyfer. Mario Bautista versus... I remember making some comment about the guy Patchy Mix. I do remember that when I was talking about this card. I do remember that. But in June, it was a big month. We had two events. We also had UFC 317, Aaliyah versus Charles for the lightweight division title. Aaliyah smoked the vacant lightweight division title because Islam vacated and moved up to 170, which we'll talk about again later. But Aaliyah versus Charles for the vacant lightweight division title. Aaliyah won pretty convincingly, knocked him out in the first round from what I remember. Let me just look it up. Trying to keep my phone open and look it up at the same time. Yep, knockout, 2 minutes 27 of the first round, and I remember just was really hoping Charles would win and get a second title reign, but it wasn't to be. Alexandre Pantoja also defended his flyweight title against Kai Kara France, which I do also, because Kai Kara France is a Aussie New Zealand fighter, and I do remember rooting for him, but it wasn't to be. Joshua Van, who will probably come into this podcast again as well, fought Brandon Royval. Benil Dariush fought Renato Moicano. Paulo Costa was meant to be on the card, but that was cancelled. But yeah, June was a big month, and that caps it off, which brings us into July. UFC 318, Holloway versus Poirier 3, Dustin Poirier's retirement fight. Holloway beat him by decision, and Dustin Poirier laid the gloves down, gave an emotional speech. But yeah, that was that. Paulo Costa versus Roman Koplyov. I do remember this being a pretty good fight, actually. Probably one of the best on the card. Kevin Holland, Daniel Rodriguez, and Michael Johnson's on the card as well. Yeah, so that's about it with that. I think that's all for this month. Also, yeah, Jones, who had retired previously, so he wouldn't have to face Tom Aspinall. I didn't mention that in the June month. Tom Aspinall got made the heavyweight champion. He then unretired because this was around the time that the UFC White House card was announced, and he thought, I might like to have my last fight there. So he decided to unretire, and Dana has been saying ever since, no, that's not going to happen. But anyway, we get into August, UFC 319, DDP versus Chimaev. Chimaev won pretty convincingly, as we all know. Sat on DDP basically for pretty much all 5 rounds. But also, this was the month that the Paramount Plus deal was announced, which meant and means from this month on that UFC is no longer on pay-per-view for the first time probably ever in its existence. It will now be exclusively available to stream on Paramount Plus. So yeah, that was definitely a big month. But October is yet. We didn't. That was the last event for 2 months. We didn't have an event for September due to Canelo versus Crawford being promoted by TKO. But we then get to October, which was another big month that had 2 events: UFC 320 and Ankalaev versus Pereira 2. Pereira beat him pretty convincingly, I believe, in the first round via knockout. Yep. 1 minute 20 of the first round. Protan came back, took his belt back, and did the now famous pointing at the ground, see, to him after it. Merab also had his 3rd title defense of the year against Corey Sandhagen. Yuri Prohaska fought Khalil Roundtree and beat him. Yeah, that's about it. That was UFC 320. But then we get to the now infamous UFC 321 in Abu Dhabi. Tom Aspinall versus Cyril Gane for the heavyweight championship of the world. Round 1 goes on. Cyril is up by, I believe, 3 punches, and Tom's got a bloody nose. There then is a very nasty eye poke in both of Tom Aspinall's eyes, and the fight gets called a draw. And it's been basically debated ever since. But Tom Aspinall is soon about to be going into surgery, actually, because of this fight, and is looking to come back and avenge himself against Cyril Gane. So I guess we will see what the outcome of that shall be. But that was October. We then get into November, UFC 322. This gets back to what I was saying about Islam Makhachev, him versus JDM for the 170 division title, and Makhachev dominates JDM in his first title defense, wins by decision, I believe, and becomes a 2-division champion. That was not a very fun card for me, and I guess this will serve as the UFC 323 recap because I haven't talked about that yet. So last month is the last card of 2025 and the last ever on pay-per-view. UFC 323, Merab Dvalishvili, his 4th title defense, going up against Petr Yan for the 2nd time. We start it was apparently, I missed quite a bit of it, but it was apparently full of banger fights with KOs, some decisions, but KOs. Henry Cejudo retired on this card. Jan Blachowicz was a draw, which I remember that being a bullshit decision. That was probably the one bad thing about the card. But Joshua Van beat Alexandre Pantoja for his flyweight title in 26 seconds of the first round because Alexandre Pantoja fell over and broke his arm. So it was technically a no contest, more or less, but Joshua Van was called the winner and is now the flyweight title holder because of that. But Merab Dvalishvili versus Petr Yan 2, and it was probably one of the best fights I've ever seen. One of Petr Yan's best showings. He dominated Merab, which was shocking because Merab was a cardio king, could outlast almost anyone. But he was just getting pieced up by Petr Yan. And for the first time in 4 years, ever since that infamous Aljamain Sterling fight, Petr Yan was crowned Bantamweight champion once again. And that was the year. That was 2025, guys. What a year it was in UFC. Sorry this is late. I was meant to do this a few days ago, but it didn't work out. Of course, we've got a banger 2026 coming up. 2 events in January, Nunes Harrison and Gaethje Pimblett on the 15th or something like that. And then on the 25th, Volk versus Lopez 2. I don't know how I'm going to do the podcast for him yet. I might do one big episode after the Volk one, or one episode for each, or what. I don't know what I'm going to do yet. But I'll definitely be covering all of them regardless. And it's honestly a high likelihood that Volk winning his title back is going to be the photo of this podcast or the cover of this podcast, because that was one of my favorite moments, if I'm going to be honest. And I'm cherishing every moment with Volk because, like I said in, I believe, one of the other recent podcasts, I strongly believe this fight could be Volk's retirement, even though he said it's not going to be. But regardless, it's coming sooner rather than later, and I'm cherishing every moment, and I'll certainly cherish that moment. But anyway, guys, that was the 2025 recap. Happy New Year. May your 2026 be better. And let's enjoy this banger year, starting off with a bang. Banger year, starting off with a bang. Jesus. But anyway, as always, till next time, whenever that is, because I don't know. But till next time, catch us.